Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to more reading of rabbinic literature. This week we are on to the Yerushalmi, as you can see up here on the screen. Just to do some preliminary work, the Yerushalmi is the Talmud that was compiled in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, usually thought to have been completed around the year 400 CE by the sages in Eretz Yisrael. Now, for the last several weeks, we've really been focusing on the Bavli, which is the Talmud written out at the rabbinic academies in Babylon. It was later than the Yerushalmi. As we'll see, it's really kind of borrowing a lot from the Yerushalmi and taking something, a phenomenon we call the scripturalization of the Mishnah, even farther than what the Yerushalmi does. So we'll return to that concept in a moment. But again, just to give the broad idea of rabbinic periods, we begin the rabbinic period with the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. Then from 70 to 200, we have the Tannaitic period. In that period, we have compositions coming out like the Mishnah and the Tosefta, and anything referenced as a Baraita that we've talked about is from that Tannaitic period, the earliest rabbinic period, my favorite period, and the period in which I am specializing. Then we move on to 200 to 400 CE, which is the period of the Yerushalmi, of the Jerusalem Talmud, of the Talmud of Eretz Yisrael. And that period is the Amoraic period, the Amoraim were the sages working in the land of Israel during that period. And then we go on to the last period, which is 400 to 600 CE, which is the Stamitic period, Stam meaning anonymous. So it's marked by compositions of people, of stamaim, as we call them, of rabbis who were anonymous and did all of their editing work on earlier sources, and then kind of adding their own flavor, all anonymously. We don't have their names, and so it's called the Stamaetic period, 400 to 600 CE. The Bavli is the main text that arises out of that period, and we have been taking a look at that in past weeks. But this week we are jumping into the Yerushalmi. You'll notice, or you'll remember rather, that last week we checked out the Tosefta. We were over here with the Tosefta, looking at from what time does one recite the Shema in the evening, and then we had some answers, and then we went on to define what really was the main purpose of the Tosefta in D and E, which was trying to define night versus day using allusions from that verse in Nehemiah 4, or verses plural. We had to compare both Nehemiah 4:15 and 4:16 to really get the full picture of when does day begin, when does night begin. We learned that day is the period from when dawn begins, when the sun rises, until the stars appear in the sky. And then when the stars appear in the sky, that triggers kind of a switch to a new time, and that new time is evening or nighttime. And nighttime, night goes from the stars in the sky until the moment the sun rises. Uvah Hashemesh, the sun comes. Or as we learned in past weeks, Uvah Hashemesh, Hebrew, could also mean the sun sets. It's a little bit ambiguous there, what that kind of idiom is referring to. Regardless, we saw that this Tosefta, in its original context, was really concerned with trying to define night and day, because once we know when night begins and when day ends, we can answer this question: when in the world do you recite the Shema in the evening, right? If you know the moment of evening, you know when you can recite the Shema. We saw that B and C here were actually somewhat tangential, right? They were really just legal analogies that people are commonly familiar with. Going inside to eat your meal on the eve of Shabbos, of Sabbath, that's a common time that people are familiar with. And when the priests eat their truma, their heave offering, that's also a time people are familiar with. So those are just legal analogies to try to help our minds understand what is a time that we're familiar with, that we know we can begin the recitation of the evening Shema. But in reality, the Tosefta isn't fundamentally concerned with B and C. And as my advisor, Elizabeth Shanks Alexander, likes to point out, based on her studies of orality theory, which, just an aside, orality theory basically says that these early rabbinic texts, like the Tosefta and the Mishnah, were not originally composed in one kind of textual corpus, right? They didn't come as this nice big thick book like I have the Tosefta and the Mishnah over there on my shelf. That's not how they originally came. Originally, like we talked about, I think last week, they were just all kind of parts that were circling around in people's minds. People knew certain parts and certain versions of the Tosefta that we now have, of the Mishnah that we now have of other Baraitot that we now have. They had versions of those that were circling around in their head. And different people knew different sections, and ultimately, the Tosefta and the Mishnah were really performed orally. And it wasn't until they were later collated into one document, they were codified as Mishnah, Tosefta, etc., that we can look up here and say, wow, interesting that we have A, B, C, D, E. We can only do that. We can only make an inquiry into the style of the Mishnah, into the style of the Tosefta, into the ordering when we have it ordered. Originally, the fact that B and C are there is really just kind of a relic of orality theory. The fact that someone is kind of trying to codify what was all said when it was orally performed, and B and C were part of an oral performance from someone, and so they go in. As we'll see, though, the Talmuds are really concerned with, B and C are there. What in the world are they doing? They're not necessarily looking at B and C through this historical orality theory lens and saying, well, B and C being here, yeah, they're tangential, but they're really just a relic of orality theory, of oral performance. No, the Talmuds want to say, the Gemara wants to say that B and C must have a purpose in being there because they do something called scripturalizing Tannaitic tradition. And what I mean by that is that when you look at what the Bavli in particular does to Tannaitic sources like the Mishnah, it wants to say that there must be a reason for every single word and phrase and the style and the order of every single thing you find in the Mishnah. And the Bavli author wants to tell you what that significance is. If you think back to our Bavli sources, when we're asking our original question, which is why in the world do we talk about the evening Shema before the morning Shema? Why do we learn about the time of the evening Shema being from when the priests eat truma? All of those kinds of questions that we were really interested in past episodes regarding the Bavli and the Bavli's treatment of the Mishnah, those arise from the Bavli's scripturalization of the Mishnah, where the Bavli says, every single thing in the Mishnah, including the fact that it in one part it mentions the evening Shema first and then the morning Shema, even though that's kind of counterintuitive because normally we talk about the day beginning in the morning and then going to evening. Everything about the Mishnah, from the fact that it begins with the discussion of the evening Shema, from the fact that it talks about the priests eating truma as a time when we know the evening Shema can be recited, instead of just doing the easier thing and saying when the stars appear in the sky, that's when you eat truma. All of that is a result of the Bavli doing something called scripturalizing the Mishnah, where it says that every single word, phrase, ordering, etc., must have significance. The Tosefta and the Mishnah itself don't have that kind of treatment or don't see their sources that way, right? B and C here, according to the Tosefta, are not even really the crux of the argument. A, D, and E are what are the central concern. They're concerned with when do you recite the Shema in the evening, and ultimately they're going to get at a question, particularly through D and E, or they're going to get at an answer through D and E of how do we define day versus night. B and C are completely tangential legal analogies. That's looking at the Tosefta through the lens of the Tosefta. But as we're about to look at the Tosefta through the lens of the Yerushalmi, and then, of course, through the Bavli, which we've been doing in past episodes, we'll see that they want to say, no, B and C are not tangential. B and C have a purpose. Now, a caveat here is that the Yerushalmi, which we're going to look at, does this to a lesser extent than the Bavli. Again, my advisor, Elizabeth Alexander, has written a great book, Transmitting Mishnah, where she discusses this kind of phenomenon where the Yerushalmi semi-scripturalizes Tannaitic sources, Tannaitic tradition. That is, the Yerushalmi takes steps that eventually are fully fleshed out in the Bavli. It takes steps toward kind of justifying or reasoning or explaining why something like B and C, tangential in the Tosefta, are in the Tosefta. Tries to say, this is why we have them. This is the significance of them. Now, the Bavli takes that all the way farther. The Bavli, I shouldn't even say justify with regard to the Yerushalmi. It's really the Bavli that is doing the justifying. It's taking that scripturalization, the reason for BNC's presence, much, much farther. So that's kind of just a look at Yerushalmi versus Bavli, kind of a comparison. One semi-scripturalizes, and we'll see this play out in a minute, and I'll continue to point it out. One semi-scripturalizes the Tosefta here, kind of saying this is why B and C are here. There's something that they're doing, but the Bavli will then go and try to justify exactly their significance and show how they're different. So we'll look at that in just a moment. So starting here with the Yerushalmi, we're actually going to jump down just a little bit. All of this here is the Mishnah. We're not going to start here. We're going to, well, all of this is, yeah, part of what's going on in the Mishnah. We're going to jump down to 1a over here. Okay. So starting here with reading, it was taught in the Mishnah. It was taught in the Mishnah, and I actually will make another note and say that I don't like in the Mishnah here. Um, we saw over here that um, well, we saw last week that the editor, who is the same editor, Jacob Neusner, was overseeing this translation and the Yerushalmi translation, and he seemed to be really into kind of putting things in brackets and making editorial choices through that. So I don't necessarily want to even say that it was taught in the Mishnah because this is just kind of a Tannaitic tradition. So it was taught that people may recite the Shema after sunset. So people may recite the Shema from the hour that the priests enter to eat their heave offering, to eat their truma. Rabbi Chia, and Rabbi Chia is sometimes credited with editing the Tosefta, so that's interesting. Rabbi Chia taught that people can recite the evening Shema from the hour that people are accustomed to enter their houses to eat their bread on Sabbath Eve. Okay, and then the rest is literally brackets, and we don't need to concern ourselves with that. Okay, so now we have kind of a synthesis of positions A and B, which you'll notice position A here corresponds to C in the Tosefta, regarding the priests eating their truma, and position B, over here in the Yerushalmi, corresponds to the Tosefta's B, when people eat their Sabbath meal. Okay. So what do we do here? We have on the one hand, people can recite the evening Shema from the time that the priest entered to eat Truma, and on the other hand, we have they can recite the evening Shema from the time that they eat their Sabbath Eve meal. Okay, that seems like it's a different time, right? Well, according to C, it was taught regarding these rules. These opinions are nearly identical. Okay, so sure, maybe that's true. But we're going to have an objection. But observe, from the hour that the priests enter to eat their truma is right after the end of the day. That is, they're not at the same time. Okay, the priests are eating their truma before people go to eat their Sabbath meal. There's a lag there in time. So how in the world can we use A and B? How in the world can we synthesize A and B and say they're talking about the same time? And how can we use them to kind of understand what we're supposed to do halachically? And that's exactly what point E is going to get at. But the hour that people enter their houses to eat bread on the Sabbath Eve is after the emergence of the stars. That's already an hour or two into the night. And so now we're kind of seeing two people argue back and forth, right? So the second person is telling the first person, what in the world? You say that these opinions, A and B, are nearly identical? That's really odd, right? How in the world can they be nearly identical? Now we're going to get a resolution here, thanks to Rabbi Yossi, and he's going to resolve this by saying, well, the ruling of people returning home and then eating their Sabbath meal, that actually refers to residents of small villages who return home right before Shabbat while it is still day and eat their Sabbath meals while it is still early. In other words, A and B are referring to the same time because the priests are eating their truma at the same time as these people in the small villages are eating their meals earlier than everyone else. Therefore, there is not a contradiction, and we have thus resolved A and B. So A and B over here, or B and C in the Tosefta, like I said, but A and B in the Yerushalmi at first seem to be in tension with one another, and then we see that there's a resolution. So now a few preliminary comments. The first thing is that A and B up here are really different versions of the same statement, according to the resolution provided by Rabbi Yossi. That is, they're different versions of saying the same thing of the time when people can recite the evening Shema. The Yerushalmi does not feel the need for making these statements out to say different things. The Yerushalmi actually wants to say that A and B are saying the same thing. This is what I'm talking about when I say that the Yerushalmi semi-scripturalizes Tanaic tradition, because the Yerushalmi is trying to compare A and B. It's trying to assimilate these two positions and saying that on the one hand, they are distinct traditions that need justification. That is semi-scripturalization, right? They're saying, okay, these A and B are different, and we need to kind of get at the crux of them. But ultimately, they collapse A and B as saying the same thing. Now, in the Bavli, we see something totally different happen. The Bavli would take A and B and say, there is no such thing as the Mishnah or Tanaitic tradition having redundant language. That's just not a thing we see. They won't even let the Mishnah have kind of similar wording or any form of restatement. That's not allowed. They operate by this rule of kind of Mishnaic. They want a Mishnaic. I don't know how you call it. Kind of economy of wording, I guess you could say. This is a concept Christine Hayes talks about. Verbal economy, I think, is actually what she calls it, where the Mishnah must say everything, must say things. Tanaic tradition must say things in as few words as possible. So it's simply not allowed that A and B would be, for the Bavli, for the later tradition, would be saying the same thing in different words. That's just redundant and goes against the principle of verbal economy. But the Yerushalmi you'll see here doesn't feel the need to make these statements actually say different things. The Bavli would want to say that A and B must be distinct. But the Yerushalmi actually says, okay, we do have two statements, but instead of saying that they're distinct, it assimilates the two positions and says that halakhically they actually are the same position. They both refer to the same time at night. So in C, we see that there's a comparison between A and B, which ultimately says that they are the same position. They are harmonized. And I just want to clarify that again, if we saw full-scale scripturalization evidenced in the Yerushalmi, then the Yerushalmi should justify A and B as different. That is, they should both get included because they teach something distinct. Per the principle of verbal economy, if A and B are saying the same thing, they should not be both there in the Mishnah Tosefta Tanaitic tradition. The Yerushalmi wants to say that, okay, we do see two different statements, but they're actually identical. It's just multiple versions of the same formulation said in slightly different ways. So the Yerushalmi's justification of two distinct statements, it admits that, okay, these are two ways of thinking about something. That's a move towards scripturalization. That's a move towards saying every line, every statement here in Tanaic tradition is significant, right? They're saying there's something happening here in A and B, and there's a reason they were included in the Tosefta. Remember, back in the Tosefta land, we said that through the lens of the Tosefta, B and C actually were not significant, they were tangential, and they're a relic of orality culture. The Yerushalmi is beginning to scripturalize B and C from the Tosefta by saying, yeah, A and B actually are doing something here. There's a reason that these two statements are here. They are two distinct statements, uh, but ultimately, the legal reality that's below these two formulations is the same. That is, the legal reality being these two statements talk about the exact same time for the recital of the evening Shema is the same in both formulations, even though they say it a little bit differently. So the Yerushalmi is recognizing the distinct language in these statements, but it's not going full-on scripturalization and justifying these statements as completely different for the principle of verbal economy we see the Bavli authors approach the Mishnah with, or approach Tanaic tradition with. The Yerushalmi recognizes distinct language, but sees these two formulations as discussing the same legal position. The Bavli, on the other hand, would see these two forms that are saying the same thing as unacceptable, where the Yerushalmi collapses these traditions and says they're nearly identical. They're talking about the same time. and then brings in Rabbi Yossi to say, yeah, they really are, A and B really are referring to the same time, the Bava would say that does not happen. Per the principle of verbal economy, Mishnaic language expresses things in kind of as economic a wording as possible. There's no way that the Mishnah would state the same legal position two different ways. That just is not economical. That's unacceptable for the Bavli. The Bavli would say A and B, we must understand them as saying something distinct. So where the Yerushalmi begins to scripturalize Tanaitic tradition is in the fact that it recognizes A and B as distinct statements, but where it doesn't scripturalize, where it only semi-scripturalizes, is the fact that it stops there. It then collapses these traditions as saying the same thing. But the Bavli from the next period of the rabbinic period, from the last period of the rabbinic period, wants to say, no, A and B would actually say something distinct. They are not the same position because otherwise that would be breaking the principle of verbal economy, and there's no way that the Mishnah is going to be saying the same thing twice in different words. Whereas the Yerushalmi wants to say distinct statements, but actually saying the same thing. Some people are eating the Sabbath meal at the same time as the priests eat truma, according to position G. Same thing, same exact time. Not acceptable for the Bavli, which fully scripturalizes this Tanaitic tradition. I want to spend a little bit more time looking at a section later in the Yerushalmi here, just a few pages down, starting here at 4a. We're going to read and discuss as we go, and this will again be relying on your knowledge of the Tosefta from our last discussion. So, note the brackets, please, but I'll read it anyways. With respect to the obligation to recite the Shema in the evening, when does night begin? Remember that the Tosefta was talking about this. We may find an indication concerning this in the verse from Nehemiah, until the stars come out. Even though there is no proof in that scripture verse that the night begins when the stars come out, there is an allusion in the verse. So we labored at the work, and half of them held the spears from the break of dawn until the stars came out. If you remember our work from last week in the diagrams I was showing on the screen, we learned that we can define the time of night versus day by putting Nehemiah 4:21 and 4:22, or in another translation from last week as well. I think it was 4:15 and 4:16. Yes, different translations just kind of do some verse ordering differently, but regardless, we learned that day happens from the break of dawn until the stars appear in the sky. And then when the stars appear in the sky, we'd switch to night, we switch to evening. And that happens from when the time the stars appear in the sky until the break of day. And so that's just helping us define what is night versus what is day. In this next session, we're going to see that the Yerushalmi is going to unpack what was implicit in the Tosefta. Actually, it's going to unpack basically what I just told you. Be there. And it is written that they may be a guard for us by night and may labor by day. Okay, they labored until night, i.e., when the stars came out. So these verses thus imply that it is night when the stars come out. That is the implicit work in the Tosefta that we made explicit last week with our various diagrams. Now we're going to continue with the question, how many stars must come out so that it is deemed night? Okay, Rabbi Pinchas, in the name of Rabbi Abba Bar Papa, and I want to clarify here that Rabbi Pinchas is actually an Amora. He's not a Tana. That is, he's not from the period of 70 to 200 CE. He's from the Amoraic period, which is the period of the Yerushalmi from 200 to 400 CE. But we're going to see that he's going to provide a statement that looks very Mishnah-like. It looks very apodictic in style. We're going to get a kind of clear ruling, but it's not from the Mishnah, it's from Namora, which is interesting. And he says, if one sees one star, it is certainly day. Okay, one star in the sky, we're still in daytime. But two stars, there's doubt whether it is night. Okay, so I look in the sky, I see two stars, I don't know whether it's night or day. But if I see three stars, it's certainly night. Now we're going to move to E here, and we're going to get another kind of Amoraic lemma, right? So what we saw in point D was if one sees two stars, there is doubt. That was kind of an apodictic statement, a Mishnah-like statement. But the Yerushalmi wants to comment on that statement. And it says, why is there any doubt if you see two stars? It's written in Nehemiah until the stars came out. Two stars, let's just use our kind of knowledge of grammar here. Two stars is plural, right? As a child, you learn. One thing is singular, two or more is plural. So here we're learning two stars is stars, plural. And Nehemiah says that when the stars, plural, i.e., two or more, come out, then you've hit nighttime. And so why would you even have any doubt, right? The minimum number of stars, plural, is two. That's obvious. So after we have two stars in the sky, you should have nighttime. But we have a retort. So again, in quotations here, we had the lemma from Pinchas. Part of what he stated is now commented on. So when I say lemma, I just mean kind of um, the text that is now going to get commentary. So that gets commentary, right? Why is he doubting if he sees two stars according to Nehemiah? The moment we see stars, plural, i.e., more than one star, we're in the land of night. But the retort is that there is doubt because we do not count the first star of the evening, for when it appears, it is deemed still to be day. Hence, when two stars appear, it may still be day. We therefore must wait for three stars to appear before we deem it to be night. Okay, so now we're going to continue reading G and H, and we're going to see that there's going to be a new focus. We're actually going to turn really to focusing on the onset of the Sabbath, and then in H, the end of the Sabbath. And I'll explain a little bit how we get there and why day and night are still significant for these halachic rulings. As we read in G, it was taught in support of Pinchas's teaching at D. On the Sabbath eve, if one saw a single star and then unintentionally performed labor which is forbidden on the Sabbath, he is free because it's still day, right? We learn that one star, a single star is a singular star. It's not plural. And so it's still day. You're good to perform labor. But if you see two stars and unintentionally performed an act forbidden on the Sabbath, he must bring a suspensive guilt offering. That is, he must do something to make kind of sacrifice for what might be a transgression. Maybe not. We don't really know because two stars, according to Pinchas, is doubtful. But if you see three stars and you perform that forbidden action on the Sabbath, you have to bring a sin offering because it's definitely night, according to Pinchas. It's definitely night when you see three stars, and then you've transgressed a Sabbath prohibition. Now, before we keep discussing, let's actually jump to H here. Analogously, at the end of the Sabbath, if one saw a single star and then unintentionally performed labor, which is forbidden on the Sabbath, he must bring a sin offering, right? So one star, we know it's for sure still day. It's still the Sabbath day, and you cannot do work. So you've definitely sinned if there's one star in the sky. But if there are two stars and you unintentionally do something, again, you need to bring a suspensive guilt offering because two stars, you don't really know if it's day, i.e., still Sabbath, or night, i.e., the sun is set, the Sabbath is gone. And you don't know if you've transgressed that prohibition. But if you see three stars and you unintentionally perform some act, you're free from any liability because it's definitely night when there are three stars in the sky, according to Pinchas, and you are free. So what we see here is that we are working with in G and H with both the beginning and the end of the Sabbath, but both of these cases also are interested in the definition of day versus night. So G and H are really expansions of the potential that is latent in the Tosefta over here. Right, the Tosefta is interested in when people eat their meal on the eve of the Sabbath. It's interested in defining the Sabbath and work prohibitions. Well, not work prohibitions in particular. It's in B, truly, it's interested in defining the evening meal of the Sabbath. But when we jump over to the Tosefta, it all of a sudden talks about Sabbath work restrictions. And so it's extracting from the Shema setting over in the Tosefta of when do you recite the Shema in the evening? Well, the eve of the Sabbath is a good indication. It's saying we're going to extract from that Shema setting, which is concerned with day versus night, and apply what we've learned in a new legal context. There are other laws also, like the laws of the beginning and end of Sabbath, that also turn on whether it's day versus night. And that lines up so perfectly because in B, which again, the Yerushalmi is trying to explain, hey, B and C actually have a reason for being in the Tosefta. In the Tosefta, it's concerned with the Sabbath. And then look over here. Sabbath, Sabbath, more concerned with the Sabbath. And so here in G and H, they're bringing the Sabbath back into the conversation yet again. And G and H are considering labor on the Sabbath, not just the time of eating on the Sabbath. We ultimately are seeing that there are all these domains of law that are triggered by the transition from day to night and night to day. And Tosefta, B and C, juxtaposes two of those domains. And it brings in over here in G and H as well. It's saying, okay, we can talk about the beginning of the Sabbath and the end of the Sabbath in terms of our understanding of day versus night. I lastly just want to take us down to L here. And I'm not going to really get into the specifics of this, but I just want to clarify, and I'll read here. Said Rabbi Mana, I posed the following question before Rabbi Chazkiah. It was taught there if a person suffering from seminal discharges saw one emission by day and one by twilight, or one at twilight and one on the morrow, one on the next day, what is the law? Do we say that he saw both emissions on the same day? Or do we conclude that he saw emissions on two successive days? Right? So we're struggling with, okay, day and twilight. Like, how do we even define day versus night? If he knows that part of his observed emission belongs to this day and part to the next day, he is certainly unclean and certainly must bring a sacrifice. Okay, we learn that the law is that one who sees emissions on successive days is deemed unclean. But if he has a doubt that part of his observed emission belongs to this day and part to the next day, we deem him to be certainly unclean. The principle is that in the case of doubt, with regard to uncleanness, we decide in favor of the more stringent alternative. That's just a principle that we actually see espoused in Mishnah. So this is yet another legal matter concerned with the boundary of day versus night. Day and night really matter here beyond just defining the recitation of the Shema in the evening, beyond just thinking about eating your meal on the eve of the Sabbath. Day and night have implications for Sabbath work prohibitions. They have implications for emissions and ritual states of purity and impurity. When day begins is really this legal phenomenon that the rabbis are considering. And we should understand that there are applications to defining day versus night that show up in diverse areas of the law. I again just want to jump back over here to G and H because I think it's so fascinating that on the one hand, we were discussing people, eating bread on the evening of the Sabbath and using that to define when you recite the evening Shema. Right? So people can recite the evening Shema from the hour that the priests eat their truma, and then we also learn that those are identical opinions. So basically, it's identical to say that the priests eat truma at the same time as the evening Shema can be recited at the same time as when people eat their meal on Sabbath. And then we also see the Sabbath come back yet again as we're thinking about these boundaries between night and day. When is it okay to do work on the Sabbath? When is it okay not to do work on the Sabbath? When is Sabbath? When is not Sabbath? How do we define those boundaries? So the new focus in G and H is these Sabbath work restrictions, but it's taking the information gained from our discussion of the evening Shema and its focus on night versus day and also Sabbath and kind of mixing all of those things up and putting it out here to say, yeah, there are more laws that turn on whether it's night versus day. There's a lot of significance. So that's an introduction to the Yerushalmi. We'll do more of this in the future, but for now, I want you to understand that The Yerushalmi is involved in semi-scripturalization of Tanaitic sources, as we saw here. The Yerushalmi wants to say A and B, they're not just these tangential statements. In fact, they have a purpose and a reason for being here. Where the Yerushalmi doesn't scripturalize as far as the Bavli is that it says, hey, A and B actually say the exact same thing. The Bavli would scripturalize, that is, it would say that every single word and statement and phrase and all of it is chock full of significance and was placed there deliberately and must exhibit the principle of verbal economy, per Christine Hayes's phrase. That's what the Bavli would say, but the Yerushalmi actually collapses these and says A and B, they're identical positions. So that's a little bit on the Rishonim. That's a little bit on the idea of scripturalization, that words, phrases, everything in Tanaitic sources, in the Mishnah, must just be chock full of meaning and ready, poignant, ready kind of to be exploited. And that's what the rabbis and the Bavli do. We see that the Yerushalmi is a little bit kind of like looking at the fossil record, right? You have the base layer of the Mishnah, and then you kind of see the intermediate layer of scripturalization of the Mishnah happening in the Yerushalmi, and then you get to kind of present day scripturalization form in the Bavli. It's really the intermediate step or the intermediate layer in that fossil record. So I hope that was helpful, and we'll be back with more of this soon.